She sat down next to me, and my whole world tilted sideways. 14 hours. One flight. Two strangers who couldn't stop looking at each other. I didn't sleep once. Neither did she. By hour 6. Her hand was resting on mine. By hour 10. I knew I was in trouble. She whispered a secret I wasn't ready to hear. Then the plane landed. And everything I thought I knew fell apart. What happened next changed both our lives forever. My name is Casey Hollis, 29 years old, a graphic designer from Chicago flying home to Honolulu for my cousin's wedding, expecting a quiet, unremarkable trip. I never imagined that seat 14C would hold a woman named Delaney Brooks, a hospice nurse from Seattle, who would rewrite everything I believed about love and courage. I boarded late, breathless, clutching a boarding pass and a coffee I'd already spilled on my sleeve, apologizing to strangers as I stumbled down the aisle. She looked up when I bumped her shoulder, laughed instead of glaring, and said, "Rough morning." Her voice was warm, unbothered, like she had nowhere else to be. I dropped into 14C beside her, still flustered, and she handed me a napkin from her bag before I even asked, like she'd already decided to help me. "Delaney," she said, extending her hand. "Everyone calls me Lane." Her grip was steady, confident, nothing like the small talk I braced myself for. We started with nothing: flight delays, bad airport coffee, but her laugh made even complaints sound like conversation worth having, and I found myself leaning closer to hear it. By the time we hit cruising altitude, I'd learned she was a hospice nurse, that she loved bad reality TV, and that she was flying home for her grandmother's funeral. I told her about the wedding, about my cousin marrying young, about how I hadn't been back to Honolulu in 3 years and wasn't sure I wanted to be. She didn't push for reasons. She just nodded, like she understood there were things people carried quietly, and let the silence between us feel comfortable instead of empty. Somewhere over Nevada, she offered me half her sandwich, and I realized I hadn't laughed that easily with anyone in longer than I wanted to admit. The flight attendant dimmed the cabin lights, and most passengers drifted off, but Lane and I kept talking, our voices dropping to match the quiet around us. "You have kind eyes," she said suddenly, studying me like she was memorizing something. I felt my face flush and looked away, unsure what to say back. "You have dangerous ones," I said, and she grinned, delighted, like I'd finally caught up to something she already knew about herself. For the first time in years, I wasn't checking my watch or counting hours until landing. I wanted this flight to last forever. Hours passed like minutes. I told her about growing up the daughter of a Baptist pastor in Ohio, about sermons on sin that still echoed in my head. She went quiet for a moment, then said her family wasn't religious, but expectation worked the same way, just dressed in different words. Different silences at the dinner table. "My mother's already picked out 3 men for me to date this year," she said, half joking, though her eyes didn't match the lightness in her voice. I asked if any of them interested her. She shook her head slowly. "None of them are what I actually want," she said, not elaborating further. I didn't push, but something in the way she said it made my chest tighten, like she was circling a truth she wasn't ready to name yet. Somewhere past Colorado, our hands ended up resting on the shared armrest, fingers almost touching, neither of us moving away when they finally did. "Can I tell you something I've never told anyone on a plane?" she asked, and I nodded, surprised by how much I wanted to hear it. I was married once, to a man. It ended 18 months ago, she said quietly. Everyone thinks it was about him. It wasn't. Not really. I held my breath, unsure what she meant, but not wanting to fill the silence with a wrong guess. She looked at me like she was deciding something. "I think I married him because it was easier than admitting what I actually wanted," she finally said. "Does that make sense to you?" It made more sense than she knew. I told her about the boyfriend I'd had in college, how relieved I'd felt when we finally broke up, Relieved, she repeated, testing the word. That's exactly it. Relieved. Like I could finally breathe again after holding it for years. Neither of us said the word out loud, but it hung there anyway. Unspoken and obvious, filling the space between our seats like static electricity. She reached over and adjusted my blanket where it had slipped, her fingers brushing my arm, lingering half a second longer than necessary. Sorry, she said. Not sounding sorry at all. A small smile pulling at the corner of her mouth as she looked back at the window. I laughed. Nervous and warm all at once. Don't apologize, I said. I didn't mind. Her smile widened, and something between us shifted. Quiet but certain. We talked about places we'd traveled, jobs we'd hated, dreams we'd shelved. She wanted to open a hospice care center someday, one that felt like home. I told her about the mural I was designing for a community center in Chicago, how it was the first project that had felt truly mine. You light up when you talk about it, she said, watching me instead of the tray table between us. I like watching you light up. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just looked at her. And for a moment neither of us looked away first. The cabin dimmed further. Around us, strangers slept, oblivious to the quiet unraveling happening in row 14, seats B and C, somewhere over the Pacific. Can I ask you something personal? She said. I nodded. Have you ever been in love with a woman? The question landed softer than I expected. I hesitated, then told her the truth I'd never said aloud to a stranger. Once, in college, quietly, painfully, and never since, until maybe now. She didn't say anything right away. She just reached over and laced her fingers through mine, like the answer had settled something for both of us. We sat like that for a long time, hands joined, hearts louder than either of us wanted to admit, the plane humming steadily beneath us. I feel like I've known you longer than 6 hours, she whispered. Is that crazy? I shook my head. Didn't feel crazy. Felt inevitable. Somewhere around hour 9, she fell asleep with her head against my shoulder, and I stayed perfectly still, terrified of breaking whatever this was. I watched her sleep for longer than I should have, memorizing the curve of her jaw, the way her breath slowed, steady and trusting beside me. When she woke, she apologized for drooling on my sweater. I told her she could drool on me any time. She laughed loud enough to wake our row. Your trouble, she said, still smiling. The good kind, I answered, and she squeezed my hand like she agreed completely. As the plane began its descent toward Honolulu, panic crept in, not about landing, but about losing whatever fragile thing we'd built at 30,000 feet. Can I get your number? Asked, feeling 16 again, awkward and hopeful in equal measure. She laughed and handed me her phone immediately. I was going to ask first, she admitted, typing her name into my contacts with a little heart beside it. Unprompted. Deliberate. Impossible to misread. We landed. The cabin erupted into motion, seatbelts unclicking, bags shifting, strangers reclaiming their separate lives. I didn't want to reclaim mine yet. The baggage claim. She found me again, pressing a folded napkin into my palm. My address in Honolulu, she said. In case you want company. I watched her walk toward her family, a tall gray-haired woman who hugged her tightly, and felt an ache I hadn't expected for someone I just met. That night, alone in my cousin's guest room, I stared at the napkin until I finally typed a message. Thank you for the best flight of my life. She responded within a minute. Best flight of mine too. Coffee tomorrow. I said yes before I'd even finished reading the question twice. We met at a small cafe near Diamond Head, and in daylight, away from the plane's strange intimacy. I worried the connection wouldn't survive translation. It did. If anything, deepened. 2 hours turned into 4. Coffee turned into lunch, and neither of us mentioned leaving until the waiter did. She told me more about her grandmother's funeral, how the family had gathered, how she'd stood at the edge of conversations, feeling like an outsider in her own life. I told her about my father's sermons, about how I'd spent years performing a version of myself I thought would make him proud. "When did you stop performing?" she asked. I thought about it. "I'm not sure I have," I admitted. "Maybe I'm still figuring that out." "Me too," she said. And for a moment, we just sat there. Two women unraveling the same knot from different directions, patient with each other. By our third meeting, we'd stopped pretending these were casual coincidences. She texted first every morning. I found reasons to extend my trip. One evening, walking along the shore, she took my hand without asking, and I let her. The ocean loud enough to cover the sound of my heartbeat. "I haven't felt this in a long time," she said quietly. "Maybe ever." Honestly, I squeezed her hand tighter, afraid words might scare it away. We stopped walking. She turned to face me, hesitant. Searching my expression for permission I was already giving without saying a word. "Casey," she said softly, "I think I'm falling for you. And it terrifies me." I told her it terrified me too, and that I didn't want it to stop. She kissed me then, gently, like she was asking a question my whole body answered before my mind caught up to what was happening. When we finally pulled apart, she laughed. Breathless. 14 hours on a plane, she said. And it still took me 3 weeks to do that. I told her it was worth the wait. She smiled. And for the first time in years, I let myself believe something good might actually stay. I extended my trip by a week, telling my boss it was for the wedding, not admitting the real reason involved a woman with steady hands and quiet eyes. My cousin's wedding arrived, chaotic and loud, relatives filling every corner of the reception hall, including my father, who flew in from Ohio for the occasion. He hugged me stiffly, the way he always did, then asked if I was seeing anyone. I said no, the lie slipping out before I could stop it. Lane came as my +1, introduced simply as my friend from the flight, a phrase that tasted like ash even as I smiled through saying it. My father shook her hand politely, unaware. And for one evening we pretended to be nothing more than acquaintances who'd met by chance 30,000 feet up. Later, in the hotel parking lot, Lane leaned against the car. Quiet. Your friend, she repeated. Is that what I am to you when it matters? I didn't have an answer that didn't sound like an excuse, and her silence afterward hurt more than any argument could have. I'm not ashamed of you, I said finally. I'm scared of him. She nodded slowly. I know the feeling. That doesn't make it hurt less. Back in her circle in Seattle, Lane faced her own version of the same fear. Her mother had already begun introducing her to a widowed family friend named Robert. It's just dinner, her mother insisted over the phone, loud enough for me to hear through the speaker. Lane's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. Why didn't you tell her no? I asked afterward. Because saying no means explaining why, Lane said. And I'm not ready for that conversation yet. I understood the fear. Even as it frustrated me, I had my own version waiting back in Chicago, a sister, Elise, who I suspected was hiding something similar. Elise called me that week, asking careful questions about a friend of hers, questions that sounded painfully familiar, questions I recognized because I'd once asked them too. I wanted to tell her everything about Lane, about the flight, about finally feeling like myself, but fear kept my mouth shut. The same fear I resented in Lane. The distance between Honolulu and Chicago became a countdown neither of us mentioned directly, though it sat heavy in every phone call, every late-night video chat. What happens when you go home? Lane finally asked, 3 days before my flight. I didn't have an answer that felt honest or comforting. I don't know, I admitted. I just know I don't want to lose this. She looked away. Wanting isn't the same as choosing, Casey. The words stung because they were true. I'd spent years wanting things quietly, never choosing them loudly enough for anyone to notice or challenge. My flight home arrived too fast. At the airport, Lane hugged me tightly, whispering, "Don't disappear on me," before letting go and walking away first. Back in Chicago, my ordinary life resumed: deadlines, my father's weekly calls, my boss commenting on my distracted energy during a client meeting that mattered. Lane and I talked every day, but the calls grew shorter. Strained by time zones and unspoken questions neither of us wanted to ask directly. My father visited Chicago for a work conference, staying with me for 3 days that felt longer than the entire flight to Honolulu had. He noticed Lane's name on my phone screen, lighting up during dinner. "Who's Lane?" he asked. Not suspicious yet, just curious in that watchful way of his. "A friend," I said again. The lie easier the second time, which frightened me more than the first time it had left my mouth. That night, Lane called upset. Her mother had officially arranged a second dinner with Robert, and Lane hadn't found the words to refuse it yet. "I keep telling myself I'll say something next time," she said, voice tight. But next time keeps becoming next time, and I hate myself for it. I wanted to comfort her, but I was doing the same thing 3 states away, hiding behind the word friend, like it cost me nothing. A month passed. The distance wasn't just miles anymore. It was silence stretching longer between texts, hesitation creeping into voices that used to sound eager. "Are we even really doing this?" Lane asked one night, exhausted. "Or are we just 2 women pretending long-distance excuses everything else we're avoiding?" I didn't answer fast enough, and the silence between us on the phone said more than either of us wanted it to. My sister Elise showed up at my apartment unannounced, eyes red, and finally said the words I'd been waiting years to hear. "I think I like women." I held her while she cried, and something cracked open in me. The hypocrisy of comforting her while still hiding my own truth from everyone who mattered. That night, after Elise fell asleep on my couch, I called Lane and told her everything about my father, my fear, my sister, my exhaustion from hiding. "I'm tired of calling you my friend," I said. "I want to stop pretending you're something smaller than what you actually are to me." Lane was quiet for a long moment. "Then stop," she said simply. "Because I can't keep doing this halfway either. Casey, I need you all in." We agreed to try harder, more visits, more honesty, smaller lies. I told my father I was seeing someone, without naming who. Testing the water first. He asked when he'd meet him. I let the pronoun sit uncorrected, hating myself for the cowardice even as relief flooded through me at avoiding the fight. Lane flew to Chicago for a long weekend, and for 4 days, we lived like a real couple. Groceries, lazy mornings, arguments about which movie to watch. It felt like a preview of a life I desperately wanted, which made the airport goodbye afterward hurt sharper than any goodbye before it. "I can't keep doing hellos and goodbyes," she said at the gate, tears in her eyes. "I need to know this is going somewhere real." I promised her it was. I meant it. But promises made at airports have a way of feeling smaller once the person walks through the gate. 2 weeks later, Robert proposed to Lane at a family dinner, blindsided in public, her mother beaming with a pride that made Lane's stomach turn. She called me that night, shaking. "I said I needed time to think," she said. I didn't say no. I couldn't say no in front of everyone. Fear surged through me, ugly and immediate. "Do you love him?" asked, hating how small my voice sounded even to myself. "No," she said firmly. "But saying no means telling my family everything. And I'm not sure I'm brave enough to survive that conversation yet." I understood her fear completely, and that understanding terrified me more than anger would have, because it meant we might lose each other to the same silence. "I can't compete with an engagement I don't know is fake or real," I said, voice breaking. "I need you to choose." "Lane." "Really choose?" She didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched across the phone line like the entire distance between Chicago and Seattle, cold and unbearable. "I need time," she finally said. "Please don't ask me for more than that right now." I hung up feeling like something essential had shattered. Days passed without contact. I threw myself into work, into avoiding my father's calls, into the particular numbness of waiting for someone to choose you. My sister noticed my silence and asked what happened. I told her everything, and she said quietly, "Maybe it's time you stopped waiting and went to her." Her words lodged themselves in my chest. Maybe waiting had always been my problem, waiting for permission, waiting for safety, waiting for someone else to go first. I booked a flight to Seattle without telling Lane, my hands shaking as I typed my card number into the airline's website at 2 in the morning. I landed the next afternoon and took a cab straight to the address she'd once written on a napkin, my heart hammering against my ribs. She opened the door. Done. Still in scrubs from a night shift. "Casey," she breathed. "What are you doing here?" "Choosing you," I said. "Finally." Out loud. She pulled me inside, and for a moment, everything felt possible again, until her phone buzzed with a text from her mother about wedding venues for Robert. "She's already planning it," Lane said, defeated. I told her I needed time, and she heard yes instead. I watched hope flicker and dim in her eyes. That night, we lay tangled together, whispering plans that felt fragile, like saying them too loudly might make them disappear before morning arrived. The next morning, Lane's mother arrived unannounced, letting herself in with her spare key, and found us together in the kitchen, coffee mugs and quiet intimacy exposed. Her mother's face shifted from confusion to horror in seconds. "What is this?" she demanded, looking between us like she walked into a stranger's life. "Mom." "This is Casey," Lane said, voice trembling but steady. "She's not my friend. She's the person I've been falling in love with." The silence that followed felt endless. Her mother's hands gripping her purse like an anchor, her face pale, her eyes searching Lane's for some other explanation. "Robert proposed," her mother finally said, ignoring what Lane had just told her entirely. "You're engaged. This is a phase. Delaney." "It has to be." "It's not a phase," Lane said, louder now, something breaking open in her voice. "I've spent my whole life pretending, and I'm done pretending for you." Her mother left without another word, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the coffee mug still sitting untouched on the counter between us. Lane sank into a chair, shaking. "She's going to tell my father. She's going to tell everyone before I even get to explain it myself." Within hours, her phone exploded with messages. Aunts, cousins, family friends, all somehow already aware. The news traveling faster than either of us anticipated. Someone had photographed us at a restaurant weeks earlier, holding hands, and the photo had been circulating quietly among family group chats without our knowledge. Lane's father called, voice cold through the speakerphone. "Is this true?" he asked. "Yes," Lane said. No hesitation this time. "It's true. And I'm not sorry." He hung up without another word. The silence afterward heavier than any argument could have been, thick with everything unsaid between generations. Robert called too, hurt and confused, deserving better than the confusion he'd been dragged into by circumstances neither of us had fully controlled. Lane apologized to him sincerely, admitting she'd let fear push her toward a life that was never actually hers to promise him in the first place. Meanwhile, my own phone buzzed. My father, somehow already informed by a distant cousin, who'd seen the same photo circulating through extended family channels. "Is it true?" he asked, echoing Lane's father's exact words, as if fathers everywhere shared some rehearsed script for moments like these. "Yes," I said, gripping the phone tightly. "Her name is Lane, and I love her. And I'm done pretending otherwise, even if it disappoints you." He was quiet for a long time, I need time, he finally said, hanging up before I could respond, his voice unreadable, neither cruel nor kind. Lane and I sat together that night, exhausted, surrounded by the wreckage of secrets we'd finally stopped carrying alone, unsure what remained standing afterward. I don't regret it, she said, leaning against me. Even if everything falls apart, I don't regret finally saying it out loud to everyone. Days passed in tense silence from both our families. My sister Elise texted constant support, the only family member fully in our corner, unwavering and fierce. Then Lane's ex-husband, Marcus, resurfaced, furious that the story had reached mutual friends, threatening to make things difficult in ways he refused to specify clearly. He's angry about his image, Lane said bitterly. Not about me. He's worried what people will think about the man his ex-wife left for a woman. Marcus showed up at Lane's apartment one evening, loud and accusatory, claiming she'd humiliated him, that everyone would assume things about their entire marriage now. I stepped between them, unwilling to let him corner her alone, and he sneered, calling us names that echoed every sermon I'd grown up fearing. Lane stood firm beside me, voice shaking but clear. Leave. Marcus. Whatever you thought our marriage was, it's over. And this isn't your business anymore. He left, slamming the door. And Lane collapsed onto the couch, adrenaline draining into exhaustion, her hands trembling in mine as she finally let herself cry. That week, her mother went silent completely. No calls, no messages. A void that hurt worse than the earlier anger had, worse than shouting ever could. My father's silence stretched too, days becoming a week. Each unanswered text a small wound reopening the same old fear I thought I'd outgrown. Then, unexpectedly, Elise called, crying. She'd come out to our father while I was in Seattle, hoping to ease the blow by going first. He didn't take it well, she admitted. He quoted scripture for 20 minutes. I left before he finished. Guilt flooded through me instantly, sharp and immediate. I flew back to Chicago the next day, torn between Lane and my sister, unsure how to hold both halves of my life together anymore. My father agreed to meet me, tense and formal, at the same diner he'd taken me to as a child after every difficult conversation growing up. I don't understand this, he said, voice low. I raised you in the church. I raised you to know right from wrong. You raised me to hide, I said. He flinched like I'd struck him. I raised you to be safe, he said. The world isn't kind to people like. He stopped, unable to finish it. Like me, I finished for him. Say it. Dad. People like me. I'm still your daughter. I'm just not hiding anymore. Whether you accept it or not. He didn't respond immediately, staring at his coffee like the answer might be written in it, decades of certainty visibly cracking across his face. I need time, he finally said, the same words he'd used before. But this time his eyes held something softer, something closer to fear than anger. I left the diner uncertain, but lighter somehow. Like saying the truth out loud had removed a weight I'd carried since childhood without realizing it. Back in my apartment, I found Lane had flown in unannounced, waiting on my doorstep with a bag and an expression I couldn't quite read. My mother called, she said quietly. She wants to meet. All of us, my father. Robert's family too. She says it's time for a real conversation. Fear gripped me instantly. Is that a good idea? I asked. Lane shrugged. Exhausted. I don't know. But hiding clearly hasn't worked for either of us. We flew to Seattle together the next morning, hands clasped the entire flight, bracing for a confrontation neither of us could fully predict or control. Her family's house looked the same as always, but walking through the front door felt like stepping into a courtroom we hadn't agreed to attend. Her mother sat stiffly at the kitchen table, her father beside her, arms crossed, Robert notably absent, the tension thick enough to taste in the silence. "Sit," her mother said, gesturing to 2 empty chairs. Lane squeezed my hand once before we sat, both of us bracing for whatever came next. "I've spent 3 weeks trying to understand this," her mother began, voice tight. "And I still don't. Not really. But I don't want to lose my daughter." Lane's breath caught. "What are you saying?" she asked carefully, afraid to hope too quickly for something she'd braced herself never to receive. "I'm saying I'd rather have a daughter who's happy than one who's married to a man to make my life easier," her mother said, eyes wet. Her father remained silent, arms still crossed. But something in his posture had softened slightly, the rigid line of his shoulders less like a wall now. "Your grandmother knew," her mother added quietly, "about women. I mean, she never told anyone, not even me. Until right before she passed away." Lane froze. "What?" she whispered. Her mother nodded. "She loved someone once. A woman named Frances. She never got to choose that life openly. She made me promise something before she died," her mother continued, voice breaking. "She made me promise I wouldn't let you disappear the way she did." Tears streamed down Lane's face. Decades of family silence suddenly reframed by a secret carried quietly across 3 generations of women too afraid to speak. Her father finally spoke. "I don't understand it," he admitted. "But I understood your grandmother. And I loved her. Maybe understanding isn't required for love. It wasn't a full embrace. Not yet. But it was a door cracking open where I'd expected only a locked and permanent wall." "This is Casey," Lane said, gesturing to me, voice steadier now. "She's the reason I finally stopped pretending. I love her. I need you to know that." Her mother looked at me for a long moment, assessing, and then nodded once, small but deliberate. "Then I suppose we should get to know her properly." It wasn't perfect acceptance, but it was a beginning. Fragile and imperfect. The kind of progress that felt more real than any instant resolution could have. 2 days later, my own father called, voice hesitant. "I've been talking to a pastor friend," he said. "Not about condemning you. About understanding you better." "That's not the same," he added quickly, "as agreeing with everything. But I don't want to lose you the way I almost lost your sister." It wasn't the full acceptance I'd once dreamed of as a child, but it was honest. And after years of silence, honesty felt like enough for now. Elise called too, crying happy tears this time. "He asked about Lane," she said. "He actually asked questions. Casey." "That's more than either of us expected." Marcus, meanwhile, quietly dropped his threats after mutual friends made clear his behavior reflected worse on him than anything about Lane's private life ever could. Robert, gracious in ways I hadn't expected, sent Lane a short message. "I hope you find real happiness. I mean that. Even if it isn't with me." Lane cried reading it. Relief and guilt tangled together. Grateful for kindness she hadn't been sure she deserved after everything that had happened between them. With both families slowly softening, Lane and I finally faced the question we'd been avoiding. What came next? And where? And how we'd actually build this. "I could transfer to a Chicago hospice program," she offered one evening. "Or you could look into design firms in Seattle. Either way. No more distance." We spent weeks weighing options, video calls with recruiters, spreadsheets of rent prices, the unglamorous logistics of turning a love story into an actual life. In the end, Lane found an opening at a hospice center in Chicago, one that reminded her of the home she'd always wanted to build. She moved 3 months later, boxes filling my apartment, her name added to my lease, small permanent changes that once felt impossible now feeling inevitable. My father met her properly at a small dinner, awkward but earnest, asking careful questions about her work, her family, the flight that started everything between us. 14 hours, he said, shaking his head slightly. That's a long time to sit next to someone. Long enough, Lane said, smiling at me across the table. Her parents visited that winter, staying in a hotel nearby. Tentative but present. Her mother bringing a small photograph of her grandmother and the woman named Frances. I thought you should have this, she said, handing it to Lane. So you remember where some of your courage actually came from. Lane framed the photograph and hung it in our living room, a quiet reminder of the silence her family had finally chosen to break. Generations later. One evening, almost a year after that first flight, Lane knelt in our kitchen, nervous in a way I'd never seen her before. Ring box shaking slightly. I don't need a big speech, she said. I just know that seat 14C changed my life, and I don't want any more flights without you beside me. I said yes before she finished the question, laughing and crying at once, thinking of every version of myself too afraid to say this out loud. We told our families together, and this time, there was no fear in the announcement, just quiet, hard-won joy shared openly around a crowded dinner table. My father hugged Lane for the first time that night, brief but genuine, a gesture that would have seemed impossible to me 1 year earlier. Elise cried through the entire toast she insisted on giving, thanking Lane for helping her sister finally become someone brave enough to stop hiding. We planned a small wedding. Nothing elaborate. Just the people who'd fought their way toward acceptance alongside us. Imperfect but present. Finally, entirely themselves. Standing at the altar, I thought about that napkin with her address. About how one delayed flight had rewritten the entire architecture of my life. Lane took my hand, steady the way she'd always been, and whispered, "No more hiding," just before we said our vows in front of everyone who mattered. Looking back, I understand now that courage rarely arrives all at once. It builds slowly. One honest conversation, one held hand, one chosen truth at a time. Sometimes the longest flights carry us toward the people who teach us how to finally land in our own lives, fully seen, entirely home. Fendi.